All right, diving into the world of open source machine learning models. You've been digging into the research, and it's pretty wild stuff, right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, tons of potential, but yeah, got to be careful.
Definitely a bit of a minefield. So we're going to help you sift through it all, focusing on the potential, but also, let's be real here, the risks too.
It is exciting to see powerful AI becoming more accessible, models like Stable Diffusion, Bloom, Llama, but it's kind of like giving everyone a super high-tech toolbox. Awesome for building, sure, but what happens when someone uses those tools for the wrong reasons?
You're saying there's a trade-off, more access, but potentially more danger.
Exactly. We're going to zero in on two major areas where this tension really plays out: privacy attacks and security attacks.
And I know you've got some pretty mind-blowing examples from the research you've been digging into.
Oh, definitely. Let's start with privacy attacks. Think of it like this. You've got these insanely complex models trained on mountains of data. But what if someone could actually extract information about that data, even if it was, like, supposed to be anonymized?
That's kind of creepy. How is that even possible?
Well, one way is through what's called a model inversion attack. Imagine you have a powerful AI, like one that can identify faces. A model inversion attack is basically using that AI to, like, reverse engineer what the faces in its training data look like, even if you can't see the original data.
So even if my data is hidden away in some massive data set, someone could potentially use the model itself to like uncover information about me.
Yeah, it's a real concern, and one that's even more heightened with open source models. Because the code is publicly available, attackers have a lot more to work with.
Makes sense. It's like giving a thief the blueprints to your house. But let's say someone isn't trying to steal my data. They just want to know if my info was even used to train a model in the first place. Is that possible?
That's where membership inference attacks come in. Think of it like a digital detective trying to figure out if a specific book was used in researching a report. They might look for, unique phrases or ideas that only appear in that one book.
So you're saying these attackers look for like telltale signs in how the model behaves to figure out if my data was part of its training set.
Precisely. And one of the sources you shared actually described a scenario where an attacker could determine if someone was a patient at a specific hospital just by querying a cancer prediction model.
Wait, so someone could potentially deduce sensitive information about my medical history without even accessing my records directly. That's pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it highlights the potential risks to individual privacy, especially as these models become more widespread. But the thing is, these privacy attacks aren't just about stealing data or snooping.
Oh, there's more to this story.
Definitely. Think about it this way. If someone can use these techniques to figure out what data was used to train a model, they can also use them to, like, expose unauthorized use of data.
Okay, so you're saying this could actually be used to protect people's rights.
Exactly. Imagine someone discovers a company has been using their data without permission, right? They could potentially leverage these attacks to prove their case. One of your sources even mentioned a case where users successfully demonstrated that a company had used their data without consent, all thanks to these kinds of privacy attacks.
So it's like a double-edged sword. The same techniques that can be used to exploit privacy can also be used to defend it. That's pretty interesting.
It is. It's a reminder that technology is rarely black and white. The same tools be used for good or for bad, depending on the intentions of the user.
Okay, so we've talked about how these models can be exploited to like uncover information about the data they were trained on. But what about security attacks? How are these models vulnerable from a purely security standpoint?
Well, let's move on to something called data poisoning. It's a bit like imagine planting a trapdoor in a seemingly secure building.
A trap door. What do you mean by that?
Well, imagine an attacker injecting bad data into the training set of a model. This bad data acts as like a trigger, creating a hidden functionality that can be activated later. The model appears to be working perfectly fine, you see, until someone uses the right trigger phrase, so to speak.
So the model behaves normally unless someone knows the secret code to like activate the malicious behavior. That's sneaky.
Right. And it can be very difficult to detect. One of the sources you provided actually described how text-to-image models could be manipulated to generate, harmful content just by using specific trigger words. And
Mm.
because the model behaves normally until that trigger is activated, it's like a sleeper agent just waiting for the right signal to strike.
So it's not just about stealing information, it's about potentially controlling the model itself and making it do things it shouldn't. That's pretty scary stuff.
It is. It highlights the need for, robust security measures, especially when you're dealing with open source models where the code is like readily accessible. But there's another type of security attack that I think you'll find particularly fascinating. It's called an adversarial example.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's so special about these adversarial examples?
Think of it as an optical illusion, but for an AI. By making subtle changes to the input data, attackers can, like, completely fool the model.
So, like, making tiny alterations to an image that are imperceptible to the human eye but completely change how the AI interprets it.
Exactly. One of your sources mentioned an example where researchers were able to add imperceptible noise to an image, causing an AI to completely misclassify it. Imagine, a stop sign that's been subtly altered so that an autonomous vehicle's computer vision system no longer recognizes it as a stop sign.
Wow, that's a terrifying thought. These adversarial examples could have some serious consequences in real-world applications where safety is critical.
Absolutely. And this is a significant concern with open source models because the attacker has full access to the model. They can, like, experiment and fine-tune these adversarial examples until they find ones that work perfectly.
So we've seen how attackers can potentially uncover the data used to train these models and even manipulate the models themselves to behave in malicious ways. It seems like there's a real dilemma here. On the one hand, open source promotes transparency and collaboration, right? But on the other hand, it creates these vulnerabilities that can be exploited.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a trade-off,
Right.
and one that requires careful consideration. But before we dive into that, let's explore another facet of data poisoning.
You mean like a different type of trapdoor? I'm starting to get a bit paranoid about all these hidden vulnerabilities.
Well, think of it less like a hidden trapdoor and more like a subtle nudge in the wrong direction. Data poisoning doesn't always involve injecting, obviously harmful content. Sometimes it's about manipulating the model's behavior in a way that benefits the attacker, but in a way that's not immediately obvious.
Okay, give me an example of this subtle manipulation.
Okay, imagine a financial institution using an open source model to assess credit risk, right? An attacker could subtly poison the training data to make the model slightly more lenient in granting loans to, people who fit a certain profile, perhaps those living in a certain area or belonging to a particular demographic.
So the model isn't producing wildly inaccurate results, but it's been like tweaked in a way that could benefit the attacker financially. That's incredibly devious.
It is. And it highlights a crucial point. It's not just about securing the models themselves. It's also about ensuring the integrity of the data used to train them. We need to be aware of the potential for subtle manipulation that could have a big impact in the real world.
It's like the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. But in this case, it's more like subtly poisoned data in, subtly biased results out. And that can be even more dangerous because it might not be immediately apparent that something is wrong.
You've got it. And this challenge applies to all machine learning models, but it's especially tricky with open source models, where the training data might come from all sorts of sources that haven't been carefully vetted.
So what can we do to mitigate these risks? Is it even possible to enjoy the benefits of open source while also protecting ourselves from these vulnerabilities?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. It's a complex issue with no silver bullet solution. But there are definitely strategies that can be employed to improve the security and robustness of open source machine learning models.
Let's dive into those strategies after a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to explore how we can balance the incredible potential of open source with the need to protect ourselves from these evolving threats. All right, so before the break, we were getting into some pretty heavy stuff. It seems like with open source AI, there's this constant push and pull between like its power and its potential for misuse.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's a balancing act. One that we're all still kind of figuring out as this technology keeps advancing.
So let's talk about that balance. You've been researching all this. What are the biggest disadvantages of using open source machine learning models, especially when it comes to those security and privacy risks we've been discussing?
Well, I mean, as we've seen, data privacy is a huge one. The possibility of sensitive information leaking out, whether it's through those model inversion attacks or even just accidental memorization by the model, that's something everyone needs to be aware of.
And it's not just about someone intentionally stealing data, right? It seems like even if a model is designed with good intentions, there's still the risk of unintentional harm if it's not carefully handled.
Oh, absolutely. And then, on top of that, you've got the security concerns. Because the code is open, it's just inherently more vulnerable to those attacks we talked about. Backdoors, data poisoning, adversarial examples. It's like leaving the blueprints for a bank vault out in the open for anyone to see.
Okay, that makes sense. It's kind of a trade-off, right? You get more transparency and collaboration, but at the cost of potentially making yourself like a bigger target. So why would anyone even bother with open source models if there are all these risks involved? What are the advantages that make it worth the trouble?
That's a fair question. I think one of the biggest advantages is that very transparency we were just talking about. With open source, you can actually look under the hood, see how the model works, and potentially identify problems, before they become major issues.
So it's kind of like being able to inspect the engine of a car before you buy it. You might find some things you don't like, but at least you're not like going in blind.
Exactly. And that transparency also fosters a sense of community and collaboration.
Mhm.
Researchers and developers from all over the world can work together, share ideas, build upon each other's work. It's like a global brainstorming session that pushes the whole field forward.
That's pretty cool. So it's not just about individual developers working in isolation. It's about everyone like working together to improve the technology as a whole.
Right. And that open collaboration also often leads to higher quality,
Mm.
because these models are subject to peer review. You've got experts from all over the world kind of scrutinizing the code, identifying bugs, suggesting improvements. It's like having a whole team of mechanics inspecting that car before you drive it off the lot.
Okay, so there's the transparency, the collaboration, the quality control. Any other advantages we should be aware of?
Well, open source also allows for a lot more customization and adaptation. You're not stuck with a one-size-fits-all solution. You can take an existing model and tweak it to fit your specific needs and use cases.
So it's like having a set of building blocks that you can use to create something unique rather than being handed like a prefabricated house that you can't modify.
You got it. And finally, let's not forget about the speed of innovation that open source enables. Developers can build upon existing models, saving time and resources. And that really accelerates the pace of progress. It's like having a library of pre-written code that you can just use as a starting point for your own projects.
So it seems like there's a lot to gain from open source, but also a lot to be like cautious about. How do we find that balance, that sweet spot where we can benefit from the good without being, overly exposed to the bad?
That's that's the key challenge, isn't it? And as I said before, there's no easy answer. But I think the most important thing is awareness. We need to be uh, we need to be mindful of the potential pitfalls, educate ourselves about the risks, and take steps to protect ourselves.
So you're saying it's not about being like afraid of the technology, but about using it responsibly and being aware of the potential consequences.
Exactly. We need to carefully vet the models and the data we're using. Implement robust security measures, stay up to date on the latest research about vulnerabilities and how to address them. It's an ongoing process of learning and adapting.
So it's like anything else in life, right? There's always going to be some level of risk, but it's about understanding those risks and taking informed steps to minimize them.
Right. It's a shared responsibility. Developers need to build security into these models from the ground up. Users need to be aware of the potential risks and take precautions.
Yeah.
And we all need to be engaged in a conversation about how to balance the incredible power of open source with with the need to protect ourselves from its vulnerabilities.
Okay, so we've talked about the good, the bad, and well, let's call it the challenging when it comes to open source AI. But what does this all mean for like the average person out there who's not a tech expert, but is increasingly interacting with AI in their daily lives?
That's a great question. I think the most important takeaway for the average person is that AI is becoming increasingly integrated into our world, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
And a lot of that AI is being built using open source models.
So we've spent this deep dive really getting into the nitty-gritty of open source machine learning models.
Yeah.
We've been researching this stuff,
Lots of it.
and we've unpacked some pretty complex ideas.
We have. We've talked about those scary smart attacks, like how people can pry into the models to learn about the data they were trained on,
Yeah.
or even, hijack the models and make them misbehave.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, but it's important stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And remember, these aren't just like theoretical threats, these attacks have real-world consequences, and they're becoming more sophisticated all the time.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second.
Yeah.
What does this all mean for, like, for you, for someone who's just trying to understand the impact of open source AI on their life?
Hmm. I think the key takeaway is this. Open source AI is incredibly powerful, and it's not going away.
So we need to learn to live with it, but live with it safely.
Exactly. And that means understanding both the opportunities and the risks. We've talked about those risks in detail, the privacy vulnerabilities, the security concerns.
But we've also talked about the benefits, right?
Right.
The transparency, the collaboration, the incredible pace of innovation that open source enables.
Yeah. It's a balancing act, and one that requires, I think, a bit of a shift in mindset. We need to move beyond thinking of security as an afterthought
Yeah.
and start baking it into these models from the very beginning.
So what does that look like in practice? What can developers do to make these models more secure?
Well, one important step is to be much more rigorous about vetting the training data.
Mm.
Remember that example of subtle data poisoning we discussed?
Yeah.
We need to make sure the data these models are learning from is, it's clean, it's
So,
reliable.
like making sure a student is learning from accurate textbooks, not ones that are like full of errors or hidden agendas.
Exactly. And then there's the code itself. Developers need to be much more diligent about identifying and fixing vulnerabilities. It's an ongoing process, but it's essential if we want to make these models more resistant to attacks.
And what about the users? What can we do to protect ourselves, even if we don't, even if we don't fully understand the technical complexities of these models?
I think the most important thing is awareness.
Yeah.
Just being aware that these risks exist is a huge step in the right direction.
So it's like anything else, right? The more you know, the better equipped you are to make informed decisions.
Exactly. And there are,
Mhm.
there are practical things you can do as well. Be cautious about the information you share online.
Mm.
Be wary of AI-powered services that seem too good to be true,
Yeah.
and stay informed about the latest developments in AI security.
It sounds like staying informed is key.
It is. And remember, this isn't just about, protecting yourself. It's about shaping the future of AI. The choices we make today as developers, as users, as a society will determine whether this technology is used to empower us or to exploit us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big question that's left hanging here is, what role do you want open source AI to play in your life? And how can you help ensure it's a force for good in the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a question worth pondering. There's so much potential here, but also so much responsibility, and it's up to all of us to make sure this technology is used ethically and thoughtfully as it continues to evolve.
Thanks for diving deep with us. Keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep asking those tough questions. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a fascinating topic shaping our world. Until then, stay curious.